word to the speakers. Well, good night, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on the time frame of the people that are watching us at this moment. My name is Valdir Bezerra. I am from the BRICS, the Center for BRICS Studies from the University of São Paulo. And now we are undertaking our traditional BRICS conference, which takes place every year between the months of October and November, to discuss the main topics of the international agenda regarding BRICS and also regarding the world in general. So today we are going to have a discussion panel that will be dedicated to some views regarding the future of multilateralism and also reforms of global governance. We have here very qualified speakers with us tonight. We have SABYA Tewari speaking from us directly from India. We have Zinto Ramano speaking with us directly from South Africa. And also Jan Art speaking with us today from Germany. And we are going to have different takes on the topic of multilateralism, different takes on the topics of reform of global governance. And we are going to have as well, after the presentation of our distinguished speakers, some time for questions of the audience and also some interventions by me as well. Having said so, I would like to start our panel, to start our discussion panel with the presentation from SABYA Tewari. SABYA Tewari is assistant professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, at the Center for Electoral Management Studies in the School of Development Studies. She has over a decade of experience in research and teaching at undergraduate and postgraduate courses in political science in Indian universities. She has also been a policy journalist, writing on socioeconomic policies, elections, and gender. So in the name of GBRICS, I extend our gratitude for our participation in our conference, and I give the floor now to SABYA Tewari for the presentation. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Valdir. Shall I start my sharing my screen now and jump directly into the presentation?
Oh, you can do it. No worries.
Okay. Okay, so our panel theme is mostly on multilateralism and global governance. And just to give a little background about myself, I am a political science student. I've been a political science student from the start, and my PhD also focuses on institutional and governance reforms. And with that, now I am teaching with the Center for Electoral Management Studies, which is a newly launched center. It was launched only this year in May, and you know, it's a course which has been designed to you know, to instruct even electoral management, experts from electoral management bodies and administrators from electoral management bodies from India and also globally. So right now I am teaching a batch of students and administrators. Of course, it's a blended batch. So with that, this is why I keep the focus on the field of electoral management, which is an emerging field. And with that, I look at, I mean, I'm very briefly touching up on only the reforms aspects on in election management globally. And with that, I, you know, when I look at reforms, I look at two aspects of reforms, which is inclusiveness in elections and electoral integrity. So having said that, let's quickly see. So in today's presentation, again, I will speak about what is electoral management and why we need reforms in electoral management, and then how are electoral management bodies trying to ensure more inclusiveness among voters, and what is the electoral integrity project, and why is it important in today's global perspectives, and also weaving in what global governance and reforms mean for us in this area. So to understand the field of elections management, this has emerged from the aspect of democracy building and democracy consolidation around the world. What are known as electoral management bodies are what conduct elections in in most of the countries of the world, and what this field studies is how these how these bodies function, what are their responsibilities, and what is the scope for reform or improvement in how elections are managed globally. Also, this field, it looks at how political parties are organized, how campaigns are financed, how voting is taking place, whether electronic voting has been successful, or was ballot a better option for voting? What are the costs involved in election? How do governments approve costs in elections? So these are the things about election management, the day-to-day working of the electoral management bodies that we study. And we study it from a global perspective. We study it more from a comparative political science perspective rather than a more of an international relations perspective. So, and again, an important aspect of election management has been what is known as international electoral observation, which is something that gives more integrity to the election, more integrity, more reliability to the electoral processes within every country. And during the end of the presentation, we'll see how globally, despite the talk of democratic backsliding, it has been found that at least procedurally, election integrity hasn't backslided. So it's been improving, but at the same time, we witness what is known as democratic backsliding. So when we speak about reforms and governance reforms in the field of elections and election management, it's important to see what kind of reforms we talk about. So mostly reform implies to the nature of the electoral management body itself, or it implies to the structure of the election management body or the functions of the election management bodies. And what has been found is that these reforms can either emerge from within the election management body when they function in a way that they feel that a certain reform can bring about more effectiveness in their functioning, or the reform can be initiated by the government of the country, and it could be an inclusive reform sometimes, or it could lead to a more extractive reform at times, given the condition of democracy in a particular situation. But but it can be initiated from the government also, or sometimes reforms can come from external pressures, from civil society pressures, or even international narratives about bringing in these reforms into these countries. And globally, again, if we look at from a comparative perspective, there are multiple data sets that will talk about how these reforms have been taking place. Yeah. So with this inclusiveness in voting, I look at two perspectives for the purpose of this presentation today. One is, what are the special voting arrangements that have started to come in for making elections inclusive for all the eligible voters in a country, and also specifically for voters with disabilities, voters, and particularly in countries where we have seen that, the demographic shift has been towards, more towards old age. So, including old age voters is also a challenge. And we'll see how, even in India, they've started home-based voting for the elderly who are above 80 years of age. That has been the most recent arrangement. So again, special voting arrangement. Also, this is something that emerged after the COVID crisis globally, and COVID crisis taught us a lot in every aspect of our lives, of course. But how elections were taking place, how elections were managed, in certain regions, even in India, and also globally, even in Bhutan. And I think one of the examples that came up in our classroom discussions from Bhutan was that during COVID, because the electoral management took place in a sort of a contained manner, that kind of ensured more voting from the public rather than it would have ensured had it not been for the COVID COVID-related lockdowns or the special arrangements that they had to make. So sometimes special arrangements for voting can actually ensure better voting and better inclusiveness that we have found in certain cases. So here are a few types of special voting arrangements that are endorsed by electoral management bodies, and there's the IDEA international group has a data set on how special voting arrangements are, or what kind of special voting arrangements are managed globally. So first is, of course, the postal voting system where you can post your ballot. The other one is an early voting. So, some of the electorate can be allowed to vote a little early or a little sooner than the election. Then mobile voting, mobile ballot box voting is something where, they can either reach an institution or a home where a person who is not able to travel to vote from their homes can cast their votes. And of course, there's the proxy voting where you can tell another person to cast the vote in your name. So India, like I said, recently they've also and they actually held a survey for all 80-year and above voters in the country, where they were listed as senior citizen voters for whom home voting would be arranged during elections in their areas. But other than that, there are other facilities that the Election Commission of India works towards, and they make sure that most of the voting areas or polling stations, as they call it here, are equipped with these facilities, which even includes a pickup and a drop facility for people who have limited mobility. So with that, of course, moving on from inclusiveness to integrity of elections. And also, I hope I'm trying to, I'm within the time limit here. Yeah. Baldir, I hope I'm within the time limit. Yeah.
No, you are.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. So moving from inclusivity to integrity of elections, and we know Professor Peter Norris, whose electoral integrity project started in 2012, which addresses three kinds of questions, which is, how and when do elections fail throughout an electoral cycle? What are the consequences of failed elections, such as, for security, for accessibility, or for trust within the civil society for election, or within even individual citizens for elections? And then what can be done to mitigate these problems based on academic evidence? So here are, and the Electoral Integrity Project actually measures in the electoral integrity as a perception, where they look at how electoral laws are functioning, what how procedures function, what kind of boundaries exist, geographically, or how your constituency boundaries are defined, then whether voter registration is adequately done, is done timely or not. Then again, also how party registrations happen, what kind of media coverage happens during an election. Then again, a very important aspect is campaign finance. And you know, especially in the case of India, when it comes to election months, even the councils that are responsible for tracking taxation are very active those days. So you know, they track, they even track you know, movement of certain goods that can be possibly used as freebies or gifts during elections to mobilize certain voters. So so to that extent, you know, even the tax imposing bodies sort of coordinate with the election management body in India. Then again, of course, the voting process, whether it's fair, whether you know, whether secret ballot is maintained, whether your ballot boxes or the electronic voting machines function properly, then how votes are counted, whether or not there is any booth capturing. That used to be very India, I mean, parts of India used to be very notorious for that, but ever since we have voting machines and you know, the constant efforts from the Election Commission have shown a lot of success in you know, being able to avoid instances of what was known as booth capturing, where they could actually grab the ballot boxes. Yeah. So and then of course how results are announced, and how electoral authorities generally manage their functioning. So these things make up what is known as, you know, what or understanding these things is what makes up what the electoral integrity perception survey. And then again, you know, what has been found in the latest electoral integrity report is that, of course, the quality of elections worldwide globally has been improving. And this is the reason why I took up this point, because, you know, nowadays we're mostly talking about backsliding all the time, but then what is the way out? Or, you know, what is the way out of strengthening institutions? So, you know, and one of the ways of looking at is that, you know, you strengthen the electoral process. Although despite free and fair electoral processes, we find authoritarian regimes coming up, but you know, as far as what is known as electoral democracy is concerned, yes, we haven't had any evidences of backsliding within, you know, within the procedural aspects of democratic functioning. At least so far, how the electoral integrity project works. Yeah. And then, of course, the key challenge these days is the campaign environment, and you know, how the media can actually impact elections, what kind of narratives come up during elections, and you know, the entry of digitization and you know, the fast moving news. So that's something, and that's something that is compromising the quality of information that voters are receiving, and that's what the electoral integrity project is now concerned with in the sense of backsliding. And thank you for allowing me the time to speak today on this panel. I hope this has been, you know, a useful presentation, and I look forward to the questions. Well, here, can I stop sharing my screen now?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Samia Tewari. It caught my attention, especially the electoral integrity project, which is an experience that has been taken in many countries. We might have questions regarding these topics after our speeches, but thank you so much earlier for bringing us such an interesting and not so widely discussed topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will move forward to the next speaker of our panel. Then I would like to give the word to Zinto Romano. Zinto Romano is founder and managing director at BAAB Media, and in 2021, she was global TEDx speaker and MIG 200 Young South Africans recent winner. So, Zinto Ramamo, I would like to express the gratitude of VII BRICS for your participation. Now you have the opportunity to bring your themes to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is my screen showing?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I just want to thank you to everyone who might be online, who has joined us late tonight. I will be speaking on 4IR digitization and its relation to multilateralism. So I'm the founder of a company called Media Group, which stands for Black, African and Beautiful, which is a digital marketing firm that generates traffic in over 27 countries in 4 continents. And our aim is to assist users to understand the importance of digitization in order to elevate and professionalize their brand through digital marketing. Now, before I dive into why it's important within the realm of multilateralism, I know you already did an introduction, but I think my personal story, which is based on representation for Africans as well as the girl child in a predominantly male-dominated industry such as digital marketing. You may see my dedication in this in some of the work that I've done, which is being part of UN Women in 2021. They have a movement called Generation Equality Forum, and I was a committee member of the Tech and Innovation Committee. You may also take a look at my TEDx talk, which is on YouTube, in context with multilateralism, which speaks on the impact of the pandemic on globalization. So our slogan at my company is, your business might not be in digital, but digital is in your business. Now, before we dive into multilateralism, I want to take you through the history of digital marketing. The COIN term was first founded in 1990, where we also found the introduction of the World Wide Web, which we don't necessarily use now. We now use HTTP for security reasons. And then in the early 2000s, we found the rise of search engines, with Google dominating that. You also had your Bing and your Yahoo, which is also, Yahoo's not as dominant because of security concerns that their users experienced. In the mid-2010s, we had the mobile revolution. You saw the birth of Apple rolling out iPhones. You had Blackberries, Samsung with the Galaxy phones, which was very, very important for mobile advertising and responsive web design. In the mid-2010s, you have content marketing, which is in relation to YouTube, social media, and quality video content is king. And from 2021 to present day, we have the future of digital marketing, which is based on AI and machine learning, voice search and smart speakers. So that is your Siri, your Alexa. YouTube also has a prompt for Google Assist, where you can actually look for videos on YouTube using your voice. Now we're going to look at the trajectory of digitization, which sees a CAGR growth of 13.1% between 2024 and 2032. And this shows an ever-growing importance and promising future of digital marketing in the contemporary business landscape. So I'm now going to speak about bridging the digital divide, empowering women and girls through digital infrastructure and digital literacy, which is a campaign by the World Economic Forum on an event I spoke at last month. So the current digital divide in Africa is related to internet connectivity, digital literacy, and also access to technology is not easily accessible. Because of lack of digital infrastructure, we also see a stall on personal and economic growth. This is due to also urban and rural divide, where in South Africa specifically, people who have access to digitization live predominantly in urban areas or are between middle and upper class, whereas the lower class does not have the literacy for how to use, a smartphone, how to use a laptop, or even be able to afford it. Now, the importance of digital infrastructure is that it contributes, as I've mentioned earlier, to economic growth, access to services such as this platform, Zoom, global connectivity, such as this forum that we're speaking on today, and resilience. Now, the importance for girls in tech, the studies have been shown where if you bring a girl child into spaces where they can learn and effectively grow and have careers in, they tend to bring their community with them. So they tend to pay it forward as well. So how do we get girls in tech? We focus on education and training, online safety, mentorship, community centers, gender inclusive policies, and P, which is public-private partnerships, which I will dive into later on in my slide. I'm just looking at time, so I'm gonna move forward. Now I'm gonna discuss internet connectivity, which I touched lightly on earlier on. Approximately only 40% of the South African population have access to smartphones. And this indicates a significant portion of the population is using mobile devices to access the internet and various online services. But a reminder that these are predominantly people in urban areas and not rural and township areas. In 2019, there was public outcry and advocacy for more reasonable pricing for data, as we have high cost of data. 1 gigabyte in 2019 cost about $10, and that has seen a significant drop in pricing where 1 gigabyte now costs $2, but it is still expensive for the average South African. So we do need regulation around accessibility to internet connectivity. So hashtag data must fall changes to data for all. Now around digitization, we're going to focus about multilateralism and policies. I'm now going to speak about data protection policies. Currently, in relation to 4IR, BRICS doesn't have an existing data protection policy, such as the EU does with the GDPR. So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, where it focuses on consent, data rights, data portability, privacy by design, and the most important would be territorial scope. We've seen examples with how Meta tries to infiltrate the EU market. They recently rolled out Threads, which isn't available in the EU because of GDPR. Brazil has its own data protection law. Russia has its own. India is working on a data protection law called the Personal Data Protection Bill. And China has various data protection and cybersecurity regulations. South Africa also has data protection under PAPAIA, which is governed by ICASA. So now I'm going to touch on how ICASA regulates digital marketing in South Africa. And ICASA stands for Independent Communication Authority of South Africa. So we have tech regulation, such as Electronic Communication Act, which governs licensing of electronic comms, which, for example, in the scope of digital marketing, that is email and SMS marketing. We have the Broadcasting Code, which is regulation of advertising and promotional content. And PAPAIA is the most important one because this protects citizens' data. For example, with PAPAIA, you need permission to post on social media a picture of someone. And if they don't give you consent to post that, you can be persecuted for it. Then you have complaint handling for consumer complaints in relation to broadcasting and/or digital marketing enforced. Now I'm going to speak about cybersecurity, which is very important in the digital realm. We have cyber infrastructure has to exist before you talk about policies around cyber security, such as accessibility, And previous slides, I spoke about internet connectivity and so forth. So China and Russia have advanced cybersecurity capabilities, but South Africa is still vulnerable. There are also economic factors where rapidly growing economies like India may attract more cyber attacks, whereas slower growing economies lack resources to invest in cybersecurity. Around governance, Brazil, Russia, and India have developed national cybersecurity strategies, but South Africa is still pending. You also have geopolitical tensions that increase vulnerability, especially in the political climate that we are in now, which makes other countries very vulnerable to cyber attacks or cyber threats. Then cross-border collaboration is important, such as platforms with BRICS, where you have initiatives to strengthen collective defenses. But you cannot do that if you have compromised power grids. So in South Africa, we have a thing called load shedding, where they basically shed the load of electricity for almost 6 hours a day. And you can imagine during those times when your devices are offline and you don't have access to network and all of that, that makes you very vulnerable as a country to cybersecurity. And then compliance. Some BRICS nations may have stricter regulations to protect data and privacy. So now I'm going to speak about our triple Ps. Within South Africa, we have, these are just a few case studies, not all of them, just to improve. So we have Huawei, which has done some collaborative initiatives with governments for rural connectivity in township areas as well. Technology solutions also enable remote areas to access the internet, such as you might have someone in a township right now who might be logged into this YouTube Live. Vodacom has done a rollout where they seek to advance digital inclusion through public-private cooperation. And as I spoke about earlier on, Data for All, they dropped the pricing of data in the country. Cisco has partnered with governments to build digital infrastructure. Without digital infrastructure, you do not have digital connectivity. And they've also partnered with government to create networking solutions for improved government services. So now I'm gonna take a look at the end user analysis in various sectors as to who is using digital marketing in what manner and so forth. In the automotive sector, this is a global report that was written this year. In the automotive sector, we have end users in the sector who are mainly automotive manufacturers, dealerships, and service providers who use digital marketing campaigns to focus on promoting new models, highlighting new features, and building brand loyalty. So you may be scrolling through Instagram or Twitter or even LinkedIn and see your favorite automotive brand targeting an ad towards you based on your past history of using search engines such as Google and so forth. In the BFSI sector, which is quite important, they want to target their audience to build trust and convenience. Within South Africa, we see the banking sector promoting banking apps. And I didn't realize how advanced our banking system was until I lived in America. And the security around these banking apps are very, very important, very, very accessible, where you don't necessarily have to go to a branch anymore to do your banking. In the education sector, digital marketing strategies include advertising courses, sharing success stories, and providing admission information. I've seen ads myself. I'm a mother as well for schools targeting ads to get, my child enrolled. In the government sector, it's mainly around awareness, and digital channels are employed to improve transparency and citizen engagement. I believe this also ties into the next one, which is the healthcare sector. During the pandemic, you saw a lot of outcry on social media about COVID symptoms and so forth, and there wasn't so much transparency. We're now on Twitter, if someone tweets something as a fact, there is a fact-checking feature at the bottom that lets you know where the source is from and whether or not it is true, such as fake news. In the media and entertainment sector, I would say this is a sector that probably uses digital marketing the most. That's your event organizers, social media and influencer collaborations, and so forth. So now I am going to conclude why we should be leveraging multilateralism and digitization. So economic cooperation supports economic collaboration and trade agreements, while digitization fosters a tech-driven economy, which goes back to accessibility for all. Ties into digital inclusion, which helps bridge the digital divide, expanding access to opportunities and services. I myself wouldn't have been an entrepreneur without access to digitization. Innovation and technology transfer, multilateralism facilitates technology exchange, driving innovation and development. And you also have global influence. So a united BRICS can shape global digital regulations and standards, strengthening their influence. And that ties back into the example that I gave with the GDPR in the EU. Cybersecurity, you have collaborative cybersecurity efforts that enhance defense and response to cyber threats. Sustainable development and crises response. I won't go into any further depth because I don't know if I'm over time, but you can actually get access to this presentation on my website, which is babmedia.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zinto, Romano, for your presentation as well. It's just a sad fact to see that when we talk about global governance, we talked about a political thought that also was intended to improve the lives of people around the world. And now we see this global digital divide, especially between North and South, where many people don't have access to the internet, as you also mentioned, especially in South Africa, which is an outstanding information. Thank you so much for your presentation, and looking forward to see the questions that might arise. Thank you. Giving the floor now to Jan Aart Schult. Just to make sure that people know the bio of the next speaker, Professor Jan Aart Schult is Professor of Global Transformations and Governance Challenges at LIDE University, as well as co-director of the Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg, Essen. His research interests include globalization, polycentric governing of global problems, legitimacy in global governance, civil society in global politics, and governance of the global internet. His remarks to our conference today draw upon a report that he recently co-authored on global governance, Fit for Purpose. So, Professor Jan, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Valdir, and thanks also to Zintel and SABYA for their contributions before. My contribution focuses on the question of multilateralism more exclusively, perhaps. I'm understanding multilateralism to be a situation where you have formal intergovernmental collaboration in permanent organizations of a global scope. We tend to think of traditional multilateralism then as the United Nations system, the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and so on. We have some 300 permanent formal intergovernmental organizations. So when I'm talking about the future of multilateralism, it's really to ask what is the future of that particular way of global cooperation. There are other ways of global cooperation, and I'll come to that. We already heard from Zintel a reference to public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are, multilateralism is pure governmental. Public-private partnerships are bringing in private actors in collaboration with public actors, governmental actors. So that's an alternative. But here I took the brief to say, what is the future of formal intergovernmental collaboration on global problems? Now I need to be able to, well, I'm not able to move forward. Why is that? Sorry, now I'm moving forward too fast. Okay, so in talking about the future of multilateralism, I first want to review from the report that Valdir mentioned before, what is the status of multilateral international organizations today? How much power do they have? How much effectiveness do they have? And how much legitimacy do they have? So by power, meaning what kind of capabilities do these multilateral international institutions have? How much capabilities do they have? How effective are they? So how able are they to take decisions? How able are they to get compliance to their decisions? How able are they to get an impact on the problems that they are meant to address? And on legitimacy, the question is how much approval, how much confidence, how much trust, how much belief and faith do people have in multilateral institutions? So what I want to do in the first step of these talks is to say, how capable, effective, and legitimate are multilateral institutions? And then on the basis of that analysis, of that assessment, say, well, where do we go from here? All the time, I think we're in a conference of BRICS and a BRICS center. So I think all the time we want to ask in this context, how capable are multilateral institutions for the BRICS? How effective are multilateral institutions for the BRICS? And how legitimate are multilateral institutions today for the BRICS? Because whereas people in the West or the wider global South might have certain assessments of the multilateral institutions today, the view from the BRICS might be distinctive. And actually between different BRICS countries, there might be different views as well. In general, it's often commented that multilateral institutions are stalled, if not in actual crisis. So when people are looking at the world today and they look at the armed conflicts in Gaza at the moment, Israel-Hamas confrontation, and they look and they say, well, what are multilateral institutions doing about it? Well, Antonio Gutierrez is making noises on the sidelines, but many would say, okay, not much happening there. The Ukraine question, ditto. People might say, well, not much happening from multilateral institutions. Or the war in Yemen, not given as much media coverage and the like in the global press, but in fact involving major losses and so on. Again, multilateral institutions, where are they? And then people might look at the DRC and Sudan and various other, and so a general view can be, well, it's all falling apart. My argument will be that it's difficult, but it's not always as grim, perhaps, as people make out. If we look at the capabilities of multilateral institutions, of the UN agencies, the WTO, the Bretton Woods institutions, the OECD, and the other formal intergovernmental organizations, they gained a lot of capabilities from the end of the Second World War until about 2010. But if you look at various indicators, then in the past 10 to 15 years, there is general stagnation in multilateralism. So the mandates of multilateral institutions are not increasing on the whole. That's what we mean here by legal power. Their institutional capabilities to take decisions and make policy and move forward is also stalled. In other words, up until 2010, you saw multilateral formal intergovernmental organizations in general getting more and more possibilities of supranational governance by consensus, by majority vote, rather than being focused on a consensus principle. So as you move intergovernmental organizations towards a majority vote principle rather than a consensus principle, if you take away vetoes and the like, then you can get a lot more done. But what we see in formal intergovernmental organizations in the past 10 to 15 years, there tends to be a reassertion of sovereignty. I'm not going to, single states sort of getting in the way of collective decisions. Material resources for multilateral institutions, the amount of money they get, the amount of staff that they have, the amount of technology and equipment and buildings and all that sort of material capabilities. Again, those are stalled. We don't see, on the whole, great increases in material resources going to intergovernmental organizations. And if you consider that the problems that they are supposed to address, climate, migration, demographic changes, technological innovations, economic restructuring, all these pandemics, all these huge issues that global governance is supposed to address. So there's a major expansion of the global problems, but there is not any corresponding expansion of the material resources of intergovernmental organizations to address those global problems. What you could say is that multilateral institutions do have considerable ideational capabilities and ideational resources and ideational power. By that, I mean that their capacity to promote ideas and ideologies and knowledge, there they have quite a bit of capability. Information, in knowledge and ideas and information is cheap on the whole. You can open your mouth and talk. You don't need a whole lot of buildings or money or military resources and like. Ideational power can go a long way. And if you consider an example like the Sustainable Development Goals, sustainable development as an idea and the Sustainable Development Goals as a package, the SDGs, anywhere on the planet you go, everybody's talking about SDGs. Yeah, there are SDGs and the numbers and all the logos of the SDGs. You find them in every local government in every country. I was in Accra 6 weeks ago. The SDGs were there. I was in Johannesburg about a month ago. The SDGs were there. I was in Kyoto. The SDGs were there. I was on my summer holiday in Madeira. The SDGs were everywhere. You see signs of the SDGs. How much does it cost to say the words SDGs? It doesn't cost anything. But really, if we look at it, the SDGs, what are they? They are 17 goals, 169 targets, 274 indicators, and no money. But the idea goes a long way. And multilateral institutions also have promoted ideas of human rights, of gender equality. A number of key ideas in global politics today have come from multilateral institutions who don't necessarily, and then they make a big impact through their ideas. So the overall view on, if you look at the capabilities of multilateralism today, it's to say pretty stalled, though the ideas are quite prevalent. How effective are the multilateral institutions? Are they able to develop policies, get compliance to their policies, and solve problems? Again, if you look at the situation in Ukraine or you look at the situation in Gaza, you can be pretty pessimistic. Then you can say, well, after all these years and after all of these bombs, what's happening? Not much problem solving from multilateral institutions. But if you say, let's look at the full range of issues, not just military conflicts, let's look at questions about development, of trade, of environment, of human rights, and so on, of health, then it's not so negative. We can actually see that multilateral institutions overall, they're pretty good at taking decisions, getting policies out there, getting projects and programs and so on, and that they also are quite responsive to new problems as they arise. So if there's an energy crisis, then they're making policy about the energy crisis. If there's a COVID crisis, they're making lots of policy about the health and the pandemic. If there's a cybersecurity problems arising, then they're pretty good at responding and starting to have policies on cybersecurity. So, in fact, although their resources are quite modest, multilateral institutions are pretty good at responding to the problems that they're supposed to address. Again, whether they respond enough is another question, but the idea that they just sit back and don't do anything is, again, if you look at the Gaza situation, you might say they don't do anything. But if you look overall, it's not really that bad. And likewise, compliance to the rules, especially if you have a dispute settlement mechanism, as in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or if you have systematic reporting, like for the International Labour Organization and its many directives on labor standards, then again, the compliance is reasonably good. It's, again, if you look at that evidence, it's not as bad as the gloom and doom story that you tend to pick up from casual observation. On problem solving, okay, here you can say there's lots of multilateral activity on climate change, but have we solved the climate problem? Clearly not. There's lots of decisions on cybersecurity. Have we solved that problem? Clearly not. We have, since 1948, how many years is that? 75 years of measures from the United Nations on human rights. Have we solved the human rights problem? Clearly not. So again, we have to say that multilateral institutions are making some impact, but they're not solving the problems. On legitimacy, here I want to push back a little bit on what you may also hear. You may tend to think that, oh, multilateral institutions are in a legitimacy crisis. People are losing their faith in the United Nations. They're losing their faith in the multilateral system. The populists want to go back to national government. They want to dissolve the multilateral institutions. They don't want, everybody's voting for Brexit. Everybody loves Donald Trump, and multilateralism is over. I mean, if we actually look at the evidence as opposed to what Donald Trump and the like say, if we actually look at what elites in general and general public say, and I've been involved in studies that are looking at this opinion surveys of these issues of how far people have confidence in and trust international organizations, they actually don't come out that badly. There are moments when, yes, in certain countries, with regard to certain institutions, so in South Africa, there may be a crisis of confidence in the International Monetary Fund, or in Russia, there may be a crisis of confidence in the United Nations. So sure, at certain times in certain countries in relation to certain institutions, there's a crisis. But is there a crisis in relation to multilateralism as a whole that goes across the whole planet for all issue areas and all institutions? The answer is no. The answer is no, and actually the levels of trust in international organizations in most countries are at a similar level or sometimes higher than the trust in domestic governments. So it's just not the case that everything is falling apart. There are differences, as I say, depends on the country, the organization, the social group, and you do find that on the whole, the general public has much less confidence in the multilateral institutions than the elites. And it's important to realize that. So when elites think that multilateral institutions are okay, they should remember that the general public is on the whole not as confident as they are. That was the surprise for the British government when they thought they were going to win the Brexit referendum, and the public was actually thinking differently than the elites were. Okay, so that's what we might say here. Existing multilateral institutions do have a lot of possibilities to contribute to global problem solving, but the current arrangements are insufficient, and the problems are only getting bigger. So we need more investments in international cooperation. The question is, what do you do and which direction do you go? And here you can have different kinds of strategies. Some people say that we should stick with the United Nations, we should stick with the World Trade Organization, we should stick with the Bretton Woods institutions, we should stick with the OECD, we should stick with the 300 formal intergovernmental organizations that we have and make them better. So where they lack enough legal mandate, give them more. Where they are depending on consensus, shift them to majority voting. Where they don't have enough money and they don't have enough staff, give them more material resources. Let them capitalize on their ideational resources more. Give them better compliance mechanisms. Redistribute the influence in those multilateral institutions so that they reflect contemporary geopolitics better. Yeah, the arrangements that we have in the United Nations, the distribution of power in the United Nations is still the distribution of 1945. We're living in 2023. The idea that France and Britain would have vetoes, while India and Brazil don't have regular membership of the Security Council, this is way, way, way out of date. So these people are saying, the institutions themselves are pretty good, just get them in better shape. That's one strategy. Other people will say that the possibilities of strengthening intergovernmental organizations, strengthening the UN, the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, etc., that is never going to be enough to address the growing global problems that we have. And so you have people saying, well, some people saying multilateralism, the traditional global governance of intergovernmental cooperation, formal intergovernmental cooperation, that's not good enough. And we need to go to informal arrangements like the G7, the G20. We need to go to translocal arrangements, meaning having cities work together rather than nation states. We saw that in the pandemic. A lot of very effective collaboration took place between cities rather than between states. People say turn towards multi-stakeholder arrangements where the representatives are not of states, but the representatives are of sectors and stakeholders. And you see that in the area of the internet, you see it a lot in the area of health, you see it a lot in the area of environment, a lot of people focusing on multi-stakeholderism rather than multilateralism. And then private global governance, purely private global governance, as you see in the financial sector in good places. So the second strategy is to say, supplement intergovernmental global governance with these other types of global governance. So don't rely on the old formal multilateralism, but use these new mechanisms. And if we look over that same period when multilateralism is stalled between 2010 and now, during that period, these other forms of global governance have expanded a lot. And so some people say, well, that's just the way we're going, and expect the United Nations and the like to become ever more on the margins, and these types of alternative mechanisms of governing global problems, that they will become the more prevalent. And we can discuss whether that's a good thing or not. A third strategy is to say, move towards, don't be satisfied with this intergovernmental collaboration, but move in the direction of a global governance that is more like a world government, where you have greatly expanded institutions and you turn the multilateral institutions almost into like ministries of a world government. So the IMF becomes a world central bank. You create a global environmental organization that currently doesn't exist. You make the WTO into a kind of global commerce department, and so on and so forth. And then you get taxes, global taxes, which will fund that, and you get global democratic elections. I mean, SABYA, I don't know how you'd have to imagine that you would have the integrity and inclusiveness of global elections rather than the national elections that you're focusing on. Now, you may all say, well, that third strategy is pie in the sky. That's utopian. Maybe it's not even desirable. But you might say, oh, it's impractical. But to you, and this is not because I advocate for this strategy, the third one, but if you say, oh, it's not realistic, I would say to you, well, who 30 years ago would have imagined that 5.4 billion people across the planet would be connected to the internet? In 30 years, we've turned into a global internet society. Or if people had said in 1940, there will be worldwide decolonization, there will be the end of European-centered colonial empires by 1960 or 1965, 25 years. In 1940, I know, because I looked at all the archival material when I was doing my PhD, in 1940, nobody anticipated in the ruling circles that there was going to be an end of colonialism within 25 years. They all thought it was going to go on for another, century and a half. Or if you look at the 1910s or the 1920s, and if you would have said to people that in the global north there would be comprehensive welfare states by 1950, again, everybody would have said you're crazy. I'm just saying, don't dismiss the possibilities of radical change in the way we do global governance. So although that third strategy may look unrealistic, you never know. You never know. And you may have still other fourth and fifth strategies. You might want to go to peer-to-peer, non-governmental, as is done in blockchain and the like. I mean, there's still other possibilities as well. But what I would certainly say is multilateralism at the moment isn't good enough. So these are a couple of ideas of where you could go next. Sorry if I've gone over. Valdir.
Thank you for your presentation, Ian Art. It felt to me that you, in a way, debunked the more pessimistic view about the future of multilateralism, and also pessimistic views about the future of global governance, especially taking into account a very interesting information that you brought regarding the trust in IOs, international organizations, being similar or higher in most places than trust in their national governments, which is an information that very few people have access to. And I thank you for all the knowledge that you brought within the time of your speech. Now, I will move to Professor Salem Nasser, and I would like to thank also for accepting the invitation of the Center for BRICS Studies of the University of São Paulo to be joining us today. Professor Salem Nasser is Professor of International Law and coordinator of the Center for Global Law and Development at VII Direito in the city of São Paulo. So I'll give you the floor to Professor Salem Nasser. You have the word. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Valdir, and thank all the organizers for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be with you, and I should say that it is a privilege to speak last after hearing three very interesting presentations, but it is also a challenge because I would like some time to collect my thoughts and see how I can challenge the views and talk or exchange with my colleagues on so many of the things they said. So I will try to go on with what I had thought, but maybe include here and there some observation about what I have heard or how it communicated with what I had in mind. Of course, my presentation probably is more closely related to what Professor Jan has spoken about, multilateralism and global governance in this more general sense. But there are some things that appeared in both presentations by SABYA and Zintel about something that really preoccupies me in the last period that we have been living in international affairs and international communication. So I will come to that. But my first thought would be a big question, a large question, and it is whether we are witnessing the end of the US hegemony. I think this is a very big question. It is related to global governance and to the role of multilateralism. I will say how I see this relationship later on, but I think this is the big question. This is a big question. I challenge my students these days when we begin our courses, and I ask them whether they see that the world is changing and whether we are seeing the end of a time, the end of an era, right? And they usually think about it in terms of a competition. If it is ending on the US side, it must be rising in China, right? So they imagine that we will see a substitution in the position of master of the world. China will substitute the US. I don't think this is necessarily the case, but I think I am certain that US hegemony is coming to an end. And this is what we are witnessing, and it has huge consequences on many of the things we are talking about. In an expression that a Brazilian colleague found, and I think is very happy one, he speaks and writes about something he calls the post-Western world. So I think this is a very good image for us to think about what the world may be transforming into. And I will try to illustrate this idea in a very short time. So I will try to be more, let's say, brief, but more colorful in my illustration. Is that I have lived long enough to have seen the moment when the US rose to the position of the sole power in the world, right? I was studying international law in Paris when the first Gulf War happened, and the US had no competition at the Security Council. There was no chance of a Soviet veto, and everybody was celebrating the fact that finally the UN Security Council had worked as it had been designed to do, responding to an international crisis and to a very clear illegal invasion of Kuwait by Iraq at the time. And I, at that time already being a student there, I was challenging my colleagues and saying, I don't think this is enough, because what we are seeing is an accident, right? What we are seeing is United States sole power being exerted through a multilateral mechanism that is the accident of history. But the reality of what we were seeing was something else, right? But now, 30 years later, 32 years later, we seem to be witnessing the end of what had begun in the 1990s. The unique power in the world is no more, right? We are shifting into a world where several powers are challenging this unique position of the United States. So within those 30 years, I witnessed, because I follow very much Middle Eastern affairs, and this is why I am now practically improvising my talk, because I have been totally taken by Gaza affairs and Palestine, and but it talks to what we are speaking about. It relates to what we are speaking about. So during those 30 years, I have lived a time where the United States, and especially after George Bush, the son, they were thinking of remaking the whole Middle East. No, they were going to construct the whole Middle East after 9/11. They would attack 7 countries in 5 years, and they will export what they call democracy into the Middle East, and they were going to change the world and make it into its own image, right? At least this was the speech, right? This was the discourse. And then after the first war or first invasion in Afghanistan, and then the second in Iraq, they saw that probably it wasn't going to work, right? To export democracy through war. It wasn't going to work because they couldn't sustain 2 wars, 2 long wars for much longer. Of course, they have sustained them for 20 years, but they couldn't sustain 5 or 6 more wars, right? In countries that were probably more problematic, like Iran or Syria or Lebanon or Yemen. So in this meantime, the US has discovered the limits of its military power. They discovered that they could invade Iraq and topple the government, that they could invade Afghanistan and topple the government. But it took them some 20 years to recognize that they couldn't do it anymore, that it wasn't enough to invade and topple the government, but they couldn't do putting their own soldiers on the ground themselves. So they had to resort to another kind of military tactics or strategy, which is to fight through third persons, right? To third parties, local generally. Also within the 30 years, I have witnessed the so-called Arab Spring, in which the US continued its effort to remake the Middle East, but now through other means, also doing the fighting through third parties, right? But they still really believe that they were in charge of the whole game. So I remember very clearly that around 2012, 2013, when I was asked to speak about what was going on in Syria and in the Middle East, people were very skeptical about Russian capabilities. They would say, well, you know, Russia is a forgotten power. It's no longer a power. But they have this this last piece of a foothold in Syria, in a port, right? And this is what they are trying to protect while they veto US resolutions in the UN, or while they're trying not to approve military interventions against Syria. And I used to say, I think there is something different here. I think China and Russia are voting as they are doing in the Security Council, or as they were doing at that time in the Security Council, because they are announcing to the world that they are back in the game, right? Russia is telling the world that they are back in the game. They are, again, a big power to be reckoned with. And China, of course, they are more subtle than Russia, but they were sending the same message. And what we see today, and it has been materialized in the Ukraine war, is that yes, Russia is back with a bang, right? They are back to the game as a huge power. And my reading, for example, of the Ukrainian war has been totally different from what we have been hearing in the West. Now we don't hear anymore because now we have forgotten about the Ukraine. It was such a vital theme a couple of years ago, and now it is forgotten. right? And this has something to do with what I was hinting towards the two first presentations about public opinion and manufacturing consent, if you want, and how information circulates and how we represent the world. And this has, of course, it has consequences for electoral processes, but also for how we construct reality, you know, how we view legitimacy and how we view power. But I was reading the Ukrainian war in a totally different way, and I was not believing the narrative that Russia had already lost the war before it had started. I was always very sure that Russia would win the war, and I think I was right. And now we know I think I was right. But I don't think it was it needed a very huge effort from my part. It was just looking at reality. And the fact is that I was very, very impressed with the way in which people could sell us narratives that were so clearly wrong, right, for their own purposes, because they could be revealed to be wrong later on. But the importance of it was that it was perceived as right at that moment. This was its function, right? And exactly the same thing is happening again now in Palestine and in Gaza, right? We receive narratives that are naturalized, that we receive given representations of what is happening in the world. And I believe if you look a little bit more critically, you find out that there's something wrong with the narrative, right? But both cases, Ukraine and Palestine, have shown, to my understanding at least, the limits of American and Western power. I was insisting on the US hegemony, but of course, it has always been accompanied by the Europeans, or the Western Europeans at least. And what Ukraine has shown us is the complete depletion of European power. There is no more Europe to be reckoned with, right? Its submission to the United States was made very clear during the Ukraine war, and the limits of American power were made very clear during the Ukraine war. And now, as we see the United States rushing into the Middle East to give support to Israel in all manners possible, with its naval fleet, with its planes, with its bombs, with its generals, its commandos, right? You can feel that the US has felt the fragility of its ally in the Middle East, and it needed to go by itself, help them there personally, I mean, right? With a direct presence to maybe hold them together, hold its Middle Eastern scheme together. So, of course, I'm talking in terms of realistic realistic reading of the world, let's say, speaking mostly about power. But I also think it extends into other dimensions, for example, in what Professor Jan has called the ideational power. No? I think this also has been eroded, and I think it's coming into a very deep crisis. I will give just two examples of this as I, let's say, observe them. One is, for example, international criminal justice, right? Speaking about Ukraine and Palestine. the ICC needed only 1 year to give a arrest warrant for Putin, right? So they only needed to investigate for 1 year and decide to arrest Putin. But they have been investigating Palestine for 5 or 6 years, and they have not been able to do anything about Palestine, right? So it shows you that there is something in the system that is not working, because people perceive legitimacy not only as, and this was something that a provocation that I was going to put to Professor Jan, is that we can think legitimacy, of course, as perception, but I include in my understanding of legitimacy what you have called effectiveness, and I would say justice. So if the system does not work justly, I don't know if it is legitimate still, or if it should be seen as legitimate, right? But in any case, we are seeing a crisis, and I will I know I have probably past the time that was allowed to me, but I will try to finish in 2 minutes. The thing about the multilateralism and the governance system in the world is that I had this intuition. I have to test it and to work with it probably for the rest of my life. But I have been working with the idea of legal imperialism. So I was inspired by what I have been reading about colonialism and the legal aspect of colonialism and how you export and impose into others legal models. And I came across this intuition that the international legal system is a legal system that mirrors US hegemony. So as the US hegemony comes to an end, probably the whole system will come into a crisis. And I don't know if it can be reformed, or if it must be in some way substituted by interim schemes of governance until we get to another world equilibrium. But you see that China, Russia, and others are trying to mirror the institutions of the US hegemony, the World Bank, the World Fund, the SWIFT system, and all that, in order to escape the institutions that still respond to American power. And I think BRICS is before this kind of challenge now, how to reconstruct this world and how to participate in this reconstruction. I think there is a difference between BRICS countries who are part of Eurasia, because I think the center of the world has shifted again into Eurasia. And there is a different challenge for people like us in Brazil, who are not in Eurasia but would like to be a part in the new scheme of things, right? And I think this challenge has grown with the amplification of BRICS, because the amplification is taking part in Eurasia, basically, right? If we take out Argentina, the rest is just Eurasia at the heart of the new world, right? But I would like to just end with this. I wanted very much to, not to challenge, but to interrogate Saumya and Zintel, and maybe converse with Professor Jan on what I heard from them. But this thing of the narrative, because, for example, Zintel was talking about the governance of the internet and data. The question is whether there is not a power emerging that is beyond the states, a private power that has the ability to concentrate all this data, all this information, to dominate the complexity of the regulation, right? And make us think and feel and talk as they would like us to, you see? Of course, it's a very general challenge now because I have spoken for too long, but we could enter into details later on if you like. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Professor Salem Nasser, for your very informative and also, I would say, provocative take on the future of multilateralism and global governance, also associating it with an understanding of the decline of US hegemony within your speech. It was quite interesting to hear from you. So coming to the end of our panel, I would like to make one provocation, one intervention to each one of you, but I ask you to be short in your replies because for some of our colleagues it's pretty early, either in dawn or in the night. So I would just start with SABYA Tewari. SABYA Tewari, I would like to know to just give a short reply to a certain question. How do you assess the contradictory assertions that electoral processes are improving, as you mentioned during your presentation, and at the same time, in many places, people feel a democratic deficit?
Yes.
Those two contradictory assertions existing at the same time.
Thanks. Shall I start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, processes improving is, it has to do more with what is known as electoral democracy. So, on the one hand, the systems are in place. Elections are mostly free and fair. I wouldn't say entirely free and fair. I wouldn't say everybody, everybody would believe in it. But again, I would like to go more with what Professor Jan proposed. That you can't always be pessimistic about how institutions work, how legitimacy works, or how narratives come up. Yeah, so at least the Integrity Project, the way they are measuring perceptions, what they have found is that all in all, and I'm not saying that it isn't declining everywhere. If you look at the data set, you'll find that they measure integrity in a way, and on the other hand, there is the democratic backsliding, which we can see in all the democracy indices in the world. And but what is causing the backsliding is mostly to do with narratives, which is what I end my presentation with. So processes are in place, yet somehow we end up with authoritarian or at least a shift towards authoritarian regimes is what the democratic backsliding project tells us. But and that is a contradiction that kind of fascinates me, because on the one hand, I mean, I've done some research on how narratives are formed. I did a comparative sort of a study. I mean, it's still a working paper. I haven't published it yet, but I presented it in some conferences. So what I've seen, and this is like a global, it's like a global phenomena that we saw the Brexit elections, we saw elections in the US, and comparatively, in 2014 onwards, we've seen elections in India, where we have seen that narratives have been captured in a way that, we're still, I mean, at least I am still finding it fascinating to understand how these things catch up. And what I felt is that it's a very, when it comes to xenophobia narratives, which was a very clear narrative in Brexit, in the Trump election, and in also it's becoming, xenophobia is also an interesting narrative when you look at elections in India. So that narrative is like a very easy human propensity to tap in an election campaign, right? So and I'm still working on this paper, but as far as democracy goes, yes, there is backsliding, but as far as processes go, at least what indices show us that they are in place. but yet, there's something missing here, some pieces missing here probably, which are not working in favor of democracy. Yeah. So I hope that satisfies your question.
Thank you. I believe that those contradictions will continue to exist for the foreseeable future.
That is the contradiction that is fascinating me these days. Yeah.
So we have a question from a cherished member of our Center for BRICS Studies, Ellen Bueno, to Zinto Ramano. So Zinto, the question is, which specific tools can BRICS countries adopt to bolster cooperation mechanisms and foster partnerships on cybersecurity? How do you see this possibility?
Sorry, repeat the question. Which
specific tools could BRICS adopt to foster partnerships on cybersecurity?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think in terms of that, I think I kind of addressed it like in short on my presentation. It goes back to public-private partnerships, because especially in South Africa, if you're solely dependent, I know because South Africa forms part of BRICS, right? But if you're solely dependent on government to implement processes such as having cybersecurity in a country like ours that doesn't even have the infrastructure and it's not prioritized, you get funding from private companies and you integrate those systems. So maybe you rope in a corporate powerhouse that is in South Africa, such as Cisco, which is working with the government, and Huawei and Vodacom, and bring them into forums such as BRICS. How can we, collaborate? For example, you can't have cybersecurity infrastructure in a country such as India that doesn't have data protection laws in place. It's a bit contradictory. So yeah, I hope I've answered the question.
I had my phone. Thank you so much for your intervention, Zinto Ramano. And also I would like to thank once again the name of GBRICS for participating with us. Professor Jan, now a intervention to you. If you could comment also briefly on, I don't know if you can go as briefly as we could, but the question is, how do you assess the tension between emerging powers that want to have a bigger voice in multilateral institutions and the so-called status quo power who want to keep things the way they are?
No, thanks very much for that question, and also many thanks to Salim Nasser for a lot of really good comments. Could I just maybe say a few things, thoughts? If I preface this though by saying my normative agenda is one of emancipatory transformation. That's my normative agenda. But I also have to do an empirical analysis. And the empirical analysis may not always give me the vision that I would like to see on the emancipatory side. But then it can also make me think and be realistic about what the situation is and what one can do. So I think that a lot of points are good there. But just on the hegemony question here, my sense is that the U.S. hegemony, in the sense of having a unipolar situation in world politics, was only a very brief moment in the mid-1940s and in the early 1990s. And those are the only moments when you could really say that the U.S. had a full preponderance of resources globally, that it was taking the major initiative and lead in setting the rules for world politics, and where it had a substantial, though never complete, legitimacy amongst the other states and countries around the world. So if hegemony is about preponderance of resources, taking a lead in setting the rules and having considerable legitimacy from those affected by those rules, then that kind of hegemony, in a major sense, the US only had very briefly in the mid-1940s and the early 1990s. Otherwise, during all the time, we had collapse of Bretton Woods, we had the Vietnam War. I mean, there's nothing new about the US being shown the limitations to its dominance. So to that extent, I don't see the situation today as being a complete radical collapse of the US hegemony. The US dollar still makes up over 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. That's a lot. The US government still has 36% of world military expenditure in one state. Second place is 7% for China. It's way down the line. If one looks at the dominance in the digital field of the internet companies, the US-based internet companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, and so on, there's no other country that is coming close to that. If one looks at the strength of Wall Street and the major global banks, they are largely US and perhaps UK, but largely US based. Everyone across the world wants to hold treasury bills. Nobody wants to hold the debt in other governments. The US is able to anyway, and so on can go on. So I'm just saying, as I say, I have an emancipatory, transformative agenda, but you also have to face the situations. And I think one can easily think, oh yeah, look at the G7 today. The G7 came out with a really weak, sloppy resolution about a temporary humanitarian corridor or something for Gaza. I mean, no other member of the G7 wants. All of the other members of the G7 want a stronger position on Gaza, but the US comes in and it says what it does, and the whole thing gets watered down. So I think one just has to be. I mean, if we really want to think, how do we really get emancipatory, transformative situation in Gaza and other places, we've got to recognize what we're up against, which is still a considerable concentration, a disproportionate concentration. And one can talk about, the rise of Russia or the reassertion of Russia and so on, but what is Russia doing? It's having a few invasions or in the countries that neighbor it. And even then, throwing its full military might, it only occupies relatively small areas of Ukraine. After a year, I mean, it's I would still say it's really quite modest. And there's some Wagner people causing some mischief in the Sahel, but it's not like they're compared to, I don't know, CIA operations all over the planet and so on. It's not the same. I just don't think that you can talk about a. So I appreciate that one, almost out of wishful thinking, wants to see some reductions and so on, but I'm not sure. And if one goes to the ideational area, SABYA, when SABYA is doing her project on the electoral integrity and inclusiveness, your indicators, your mindset, your theory, and everything is all coming from Pippa Norris and Harvard University. And that it might be good and all that, and I'm not criticizing that it has a lot of interest and a lot of good data, interesting logics and arguments and so on, but it's reflective of US knowledge dominance, I would still say. And Zintel, right? Likewise, when you're focusing on gender equality norms and the PPPs and the digital marketing and all that, these are US ideas. These are US centered and US generated things. So to me, if the rise of BRICS means that people are going to reproduce the ideas and institutions that are mainly generated in the United States and in the wider West, then it might be a shift of power between particular countries, but it's not the end of Western hegemony. No, it's the adoption of Westernism by new countries and new concentrations. And that to me is so. If you think about hegemony not as the dominance of certain countries and territories, but as the dominance of certain structures, social structures, then I'm not sure that we're seeing the end of Western hegemony. I mean, if Western is not a territorial idea, but is about a particular structural social formation, Western modernity, then, you know, it may be that everyone thinks there's been this great transformation, but actually we're destroying the planet ecologically, and we're you know, doing all the same things that have been Eurocentrically done, and it's just become a global way of doing things. And I don't find that a great emancipation. I don't find that a great transformative emancipation. I find that actually a deepening of the problems. And if people want to cheer and say hurrah, hurrah, because some power shifted to Russia and Brazil and India and China, okay, but in terms of the future of humanity, I'm not sure we're any better off. Sorry, I put that provocatively, just to show that I'm still awake at midnight.
Wow, that was quite an expected and very different answer, but I think it's going to be good for the debate, because it gave some food for thought, I would say the least, regarding the rising of new powers or emerging powers, and the powers that be, or the powers that were traditionally established as being the so-called West in international relations. So thank you once more, Ian Art, for your participation at our conference. And then I will make a final intervention here, a provocation for Professor Salim Nasser. The question comes from our chat in the conference. Is it realistic to believe that multilateral institutions still can do something to remedy the situation in the Middle East, especially the current one? So you may have the floor, and I also remind you of the time of our panel here, because it's very late for some of our participants. But once again, thank you for the participation of you all.
Thank you, Professor Ian. I will save the challenge for our next encounter. I hope it will happen.
We can arrange a new meeting if we want. Then we'll. I think it's going to be very productive. But
yes, no, I don't really believe we are so much in disaccord, but there are some challenges, and we will take them up sometime, I hope. I don't think, especially because of this problem with the narrative, you know. One aspect that I didn't bring up so explicitly before has to do as well with this idea of hegemony in terms of certain ideas. I believe that with what is happening now in Gaza, and the response that the US and the European powers, let's say, are giving to what is happening in Gaza, is that they are discrediting themselves for a few years to come, if not for decades to come. I think they will not be able to sustain discourses about human rights and humanitarian law and humanitarian interventions, especially when people have access to two narratives that were so close one to the other in time. So we have the discourse on Ukraine on one side, and then you have the discourse on Gaza, and they are completely divorced from each other. And in these circumstances, not only we are blocked in terms of functioning of the multilateral mechanisms, because, well, the UN, the General Assembly, has said what it has to say, but that's the limit of it. No, people have voted for a humanitarian pause and but the Security Council will not move, and Israel will not be moved or stopped by anything other than the US pressure. And in the same time, the West, especially Western officials, they are sustaining discourses that are untenable, and that people begin to perceive as being hypocritical and problematics in terms of values. No, So I'm not an optimistic on what multilateral institutions will be able to do in this case. In this case, it will be resolved on sheer power, you know, on the ground. The most powerful will win the fight. And here power is relative, no? Because in this kind of war, this kind of terrain, victory and defeat are to be judged differently. So we'll see what happens, but I don't think that institutions are going to be able to do much. I thank you very much once again to all of you, because you have made me think, and it is nice to do that.
Yeah, I believe it was a pleasure for our listeners. So I would just make an announcement that the presence list is on the commentary section of YouTube. So for the ones who are watching us right now, the presence list is there. I would like to thank once again for all the participants of our 7th BRICS Conference for the University of São Paulo. It was an honor for all of us, for our group, especially for me, who mediated this very interesting panel. Thank you, Salmia Teuari, Zinto Ramano, Ian Art, Salem Nasser for your participation. I hope I see you in future meetings, and then we can further our cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you.
a good rest,
Thank you.
everyone.